It's time to dig into the second question of the B2 First writing exam. So this includes the article, the review, the email or letter, and the report or story if you're doing the B2 First for schools. We already looked at the writing exam as a whole, looked at the assessment criteria, and covered all the details of the essay in the previous video. So if you haven't watched that already, I really recommend you do. It's up there and down in the description. Right, the second question gives the student a choice of 3 different tasks they can do. All of the options are of a different task, and if we look at the Cambridge sample writing paper, which you can again download in the description, we see that there's a review, an article, and an email to a friend. Other options that could appear are a formal letter, or a report, or in the case of First for Schools, a story, and even an essay based on a book or a movie that they've studied in class. Now, I've never done this, I don't recommend you do, so most of the time you can just ignore that one. Plus it comes as the 4th option, so you don't really need to worry about it popping up. And we don't even need to prepare our students for all of these question types. You can drop 1 and even 2 if you're short on time. But before I explain how to do that, we're going to briefly look at each of the different questions so we're better informed about which ones we should keep and focus on and which ones we can forget about. So we'll start with the article. This is almost always informal or neutral, and it's written for a website or a magazine or something like that. The student has to write about their opinions and personal experiences of something familiar, like music, or in the case of the sample paper, learning something. And it should be engaging for the reader. The second type is a review. This is also going to be informal or neutral and is written for a website or a magazine most of the time. But this isn't always the case, sometimes it can be a little more formal. In a review, the student has to describe, evaluate, and recommend the product. It could be a book, a movie, a course, or whatever. Then we have the email or letter. Now this counts as one question type. The email letter difference doesn't really matter, but it does matter if it's informal to a friend or something, or formal to an employer or a company or something, because the way you write those letters are going to be completely different. So for me, really, you're practicing 2 different questions here. Generally, I see informal emails coming up most of the time, like this one in the sample paper, which is an email to David, a friend. So this should be completely informal. And then we have the report, which is usually an account of something and maybe a recommendation. It's informational, formal/neutral, and generally quite dry and boring. And the story gives the student the first sentence that they have to write and then a few different points like an event or a place that they have to include in their story. The style is going to be generally neutral or informal. To be honest, I've very rarely prepared students for doing a story. Usually I'm not preparing for the First for Schools, and when I am, I don't tend to focus on a story. My students don't really want to do that either. And as there are 3 tasks that will come up in the exam, you can not prepare one of them completely and be sure that 2 other tasks will be ones you've prepared for. For me, it's mostly the story or the report that goes. I find most students like to write informally, and the formal structure of the report is a little bit difficult, and the story is quite hard to manage and keep concise and not get distracted. However, if a student shows a particular tendency or preference toward a story or the report, then I'll stick with that and ditch one of the others. You might be thinking you can ditch 2 of the question types. They're always going to have one that they've prepared for, right? And you could do this if you're really short on time, but there's a reason why I absolutely don't recommend it if possible. And that is the topic of what they have to write about might not be suitable. Let's say you've got this sample test example, you've got a review, an article, and an email. You don't bother preparing the email and you don't bother preparing the article. So they've got to do a review about a book in which the character does something surprising. That might be quite difficult for your student to write about. They might not be interested in books and stories and that kind of thing, and they just don't want to do that at all. If you haven't prepared at least one of the other options, they're stuck with that. However, if you're really pressed for time and your student is willing to take the risk, you can not prepare 2 of the writing tasks and just hope that those 2 don't come up, and if they do, then the other one is a topic that is suitable for them. What I absolutely don't recommend you do is not prepare for 3 of them, because you're really running the risk that all 3 turn up and your student is completely screwed. Now, if you have all the time in the world to prepare, you could practice all of the writing types. This covers all bases, but it might be spreading your students a bit too thin. So even if I have a year to prepare, I'll still ditch one of the possible writing tasks. The more writing tasks they have to think about, the less effective they'll be on the ones that they do prepare. So I always like to get rid of one, just forget about it and really focus on the other ones. I mean, ultimately they're going to have their preferences and they're probably not going to choose one of the types anyway, so there's no point spending a lot of time going into detail and spending a lot of mental effort on it. And which one you ignore is up to you and your students, but if you're not sure, I usually go with the report or the story. Either that or the letter/email. This can be a little bit problematic. Usually the informal email is fine, but if it's a formal letter, some students, especially younger ones, have quite a few problems with this. In a moment, we'll get into each question type in detail, but first I want to explain the general process for all of them. Because before writing anything, students must read the question carefully. This is because each question will be slightly different. They put in their different variations, so the student has to be really careful. If they think that a review is always informal, but it turns out to be for a more formal audience, and they don't read the question properly, they're going to lose marks. So they need to identify who the target reader is, and then decide what register and what tone they're going to write in. Usually this is fairly self-explanatory. A website or a magazine is going to be informal, like writing to a friend kind of, and if it's to your boss or to a colleague or a teacher, then it's going to be more formal. And if they get this right, they'll get more points in the communicative achievement category of assessment. The next thing to do is identify all of the key points they must include to get the most marks in the content category. This is about answering the question with enough detail. Following that, they'll make a brief plan of what to include in each paragraph. This is usually the same, but there are some variations for each question type. And then they can get straight into writing, but that's not the end. Because once they've finished writing the first copy, they need to go back and edit and review. That doesn't mean just fixing all of the grammar mistakes, but it also means checking that they've used the right tone and register, making sure that they have included all of the key points. In addition, they can look for ways of improving their language. Can they add in more interesting vocabulary and grammar? And perhaps, if they've got time, they can write their scribbled first draft nice and clean as another copy. This last stage of editing and reviewing is often overlooked, and it leads to quite a few points being dropped that could otherwise be easily gained. So with that process in mind, let's look at the first question type, which is going to be an article. Now we're taking this example from the sample paper, which is on the Cambridge website, and we'll be doing that throughout. So first step, let's read the question. Here it is. You see this announcement on an English language website. Articles wanted. The most useful thing I have ever learned. What is the most useful thing you have learned? Who did you learn it from? Why is it useful? Write us an article answering these questions. We will publish the best articles on our website. Write your article. So we've read it, now we need to identify the target reader. This is fairly straightforward. It says it's for an English language website, so it will be people reading articles online. That means it should be more informal and have an engaging, friendly tone. They're pretty much always for a magazine or website, and the idea is to inform and entertain and maybe even convince the reader of something. And next we can focus on the key points to write about. What is the most useful thing you have learned? So we need to describe and explain that a little. Then, who did you learn from and why is it useful? So these 3 points are super important and should provide the basis for our initial plan. The best article structure is very similar to the essay in that it has an introduction, it has the 3 key points, and then it has a conclusion. And each of those key points paragraphs are going to be the ones that we take from the question. But first, we need a title, and this can be super simple. In fact, you can just have the title that they give you in the question, really. Or you could try to be clever and add something else in, but it doesn't really matter. We're going to go with the most valuable thing I ever learned. Now we have the introduction. In this, we need to tell the reader what the article is about, and we need to get them engaged. The article needs to keep the reader going to the end, so we need to hook them in. And the best way to do this is with a rhetorical question. Have you ever learned something that changed your life? Boom! Straight away we're getting points for communicative achievement. Oh, and is that a present perfect and a past simple? Nice use of tenses there. For most articles, students can start with a rhetorical question. Get them to practice writing loads about different topics. Then continue the introduction saying that you're going to share your experiences and opinions on this topic. When I was in high school, I learned one vital skill that helped me become the person I am today. You can include what the thing is you learned here, but I've decided not to, so the reader has to keep going to find out. And that's all we need from the introduction, really. A bit of engagement, a bit of setting the scene. The reader wants to continue. Our next paragraph is going to cover the first key point. What did you learn? Studying for important exams is really hard for teenagers. I struggled for a long time until I learned that collaborating with my classmates made it so much easier. They helped me with some things and I helped them with others. Great, so it's clear that it's about collaborating with other people. Next, we need a paragraph about who you learned it from. It started when my maths teacher organised lunchtime study sessions, and even though I thought it was going to be a waste of time, she helped us find study partners who we could work best with, and from then I started going 3 times a week. That clearly states that the maths teacher was responsible for this learning. And the third key point is about why it's useful. As a result, I passed all my exams with flying colours. However, the most valuable thing I learned was to work as part of a team, which is something I do every day now in my dream job as a game designer. I think we managed that pretty well. Notice the exclamation mark at the end. In an article, it's a good idea to use one of these every now and then. Once or twice is enough. It creates a friendlier, more engaging tone. However, more than 2 and it comes across a bit overexcited. Finally, we have the conclusion. Here we want to have a little summary and then a take-home message. All in all, I don't think I would be the same person today if I hadn't learned to work with others in those study sessions. It's amazing how important working as a team can be. Again, an exclamation mark in there. And sometimes it might be appropriate to write another rhetorical question. In this case, I haven't done that because I'm conscious of going over the word limit. And yep, it turns out 192 words, not including the title. 192 may be over the official limit, but it's perfectly fine. We've covered everything we need to with an appropriate amount of detail. If you put this article and the essay from the previous video side by side, they look pretty similar in terms of paragraph structure. That's because we're following the same essential formula. But on closer inspection, there's a lot of difference. Most important is obviously the register and the tone. This is an informal writing, so we want to use contractions like don't instead of do not. And we want to have a friendlier tone with those exclamation marks and more colloquial phrases and phrasal verbs. And those things give us more points in communicative achievement, which is also helped by that rhetorical question at the start. In terms of content, we have to think, did we answer all of the questions? Yes. And did we have an appropriate amount of detail for each? Also yes, so nothing to complain about there. With the third category of assessment, organisation, we have good paragraphs that are clear and distinct. They have a logical order. But what about connectors and signposts? We have even though, as a result, however, all in all. Perhaps we could do a bit better in paragraph 2. Let's add a since to connect these 2 sentences together. That's better. A nice bit of editing there. For the final assessment category, language, it's the general vocabulary and grammar that's going to get you the most points, but we can include some of those colloquialisms and phrasal verbs to get an even higher mark. We have a few of them in this model, but maybe we could add some more. Let's change this learned to found out. This organised could be set up, this work to got on, and let's change this learned to took in. Obviously we're adding more words here, but really it's not that many, we don't need to worry about it. They're not going to penalise us for using better vocab. Of course your students need to know these expressions and phrasal verbs, which is quite tricky, but that's one of the main differences between B2 and B1, so it's something you should definitely practice in your classes. And there we have our model answer, and you can download it in the description below and give it to your students as a guide. When I introduce a new writing task, I found it's really helpful to give them a model so they've got something to imitate when they do their first writing. Otherwise they're kind of just going with the information that you've told them, but it's really hard to put all that together. So if you get them to do the same question and they have the model right there to imitate, it's copying but making it their own, they'll much more quickly get the idea of how to write these different tasks. So that's the article done, let's move on to the review. Reviews are similar to articles in terms of tone and register, in general. They're usually for a website or a magazine, so they're informal, but I have seen a few that are for more formal situations, like the library at school. Again, that's why students should carefully read the question and make sure they know who their target audience is. In this case, it's for an English language magazine. Book reviews wanted. Have you read a book in which the main character behaved in a surprising way? Write us a review of the book, explaining what the main character did and why it was surprising. Tell us whether or not you would recommend this book to other people. The best reviews will be published in the magazine. Write your review. So we know the target reader and we know it's got to be neutral/informal. Now let's identify the key points. There's the type of product, in this case a book, and then the subset, in this case a book in which the main character behaves in a surprising way. Then there are three things which are dressed up in different ways but are always basically the same. There's describe, there's discuss, and there's recommend. In this example, the describe is explain what the main character did. Discuss is why it was surprising, and the recommend is, well, recommend. These are going to make up the paragraph structure of our writing. So normally we'd have an introduction, 3 key points, and then a conclusion. But in a review, the recommendation and the conclusion are basically the same thing. So we're going to merge them together and instead have 4 paragraphs. Introduction, description, discussion, and recommendation. When approaching this task, my students often say, well, I can't think of a book in which the main character behaves surprisingly. And neither can I a lot of the time. I could think about it and probably come up with one, but in an exam situation, I don't know if the pressure would get to me there. But it is completely fine to make up a book and the character and write about that, which is actually what we're going to do in our model answer here. And we're going to put the name of the book in the title. It's going to be Review of the Wild World of Sally. That's all the title needs to be, doesn't need to be anything clever. We're going to get straight into the introduction. And like an article, this should be engaging and intriguing. We want to hook our reader in, explain what the review is going to be about, but give them something to hang on to so they keep reading to the end. Last week I finished The Wild World of Sally and the ending blew my mind. I'm still in shock about what Sally did and I can't decide if it was a good thing or not. Writing this kind of intriguing introduction gets you more points in communicative achievement. You could also throw in a rhetorical question like, have you ever finished reading a book and you couldn't believe what happened? Lots of my students give away their opinion in the introduction. I generally tell them to avoid this because if the reader knows what your opinion is, why should they bother reading the rest of it? The exception to this is if you have a controversial opinion and you want to put it in the introduction to provoke the reader to want to find out why you believe that. Now let's move on to the description paragraph. What did the character do that was surprising? Here it's important students don't go into too much detail and start narrating all of the events of the book. They need to be concise and to the point, and that is a crucial skill. Throughout most of the book, Sally is a cruel and focused businesswoman who never gives up her time and money to help others. However, when she gets involved in legal difficulties, she gets burnt out. In the end, she decides to give away all her fortunes and run away to the countryside forever. So we've described what was surprising, now we need to discuss why was it surprising. Honestly, I was stunned. All along she was so determined to make money and defeat her rivals. Then she suddenly changed her mind and gave up. At first I found it unbelievable, but later I realized that all that pressure had been slowly changing her. Unfortunately, the author didn't make this clear enough. In this paragraph I used a few advanced expressions that your students probably won't know to begin with. But they're the kind of language that gets highly rewarded, so it's something to work on, those phrasal verbs, those expressions. As much as they can include in their writing, the more points they'll get in the language category. The fourth paragraph is the recommendation/conclusion. In this, we should really say one way or another whether we recommend the product or not. You can kind of go somewhere in the middle, but I always find that takes up too many words and gets very lengthy and, well, for some people you might want to do this, but for other people, blah, blah, blah. No, it's much easier for the purposes of the exam to go on one side of the argument. I really can't recommend reading The Wild World of Sally. At the end, I just felt angrily surprised instead of satisfied by the big twist, and it's never a good thing to feel angry after a story. Having a good recommendation phrase is vital. I really can't recommend, or I strongly recommend, are good options. And see how we paid off on the intrigue in the introduction? The reader wanted to find out if the review was going to be positive or negative, and in the end, we gave that to them. It was negative. 178 words altogether. That's well within the word limit. So maybe I'll add in that rhetorical question in the introduction. So our communicative achievement, we have the recommendation, we have that intriguing introduction, and the style and register is appropriate for this target audience. The content we've covered, we'd answered all the questions and not gone off topic. The organisation is good, we have clear distinct paragraphs that logically flow from one to the other, and we have quite a lot of nice connectors and signposts in there. I think the trickiest part of the review is doing the description concisely. Students might need a bit of training on this. I've often seen a very short introduction, a very long description paragraph, often with some discussion in the middle of it, and then a kind of very short recommendation, or they go way over the word limit. So having just one or two sentences to describe exactly what happens is something you can practice with them. Okay, let's get to the email/letter. This can be formal or informal. Most of the time I see it as informal, a letter to a friend, but it can be to your boss, to a colleague, or to a business partner on the other side of the world. So more than ever, it's vital to read the question carefully and figure out who the target reader is. Let's have a look at the sample question. You have received this email from your English-speaking friend, David. From David, subject touring holiday. Some college friends of mine are visiting your area soon for a week's touring holiday. They would like to travel around and learn about your local area and its history. Can you tell me about some of the places they could visit? What's the best way to travel around? Car, bike, or coach? Thanks, David. Write your email. First of all, it's a friend, so we're firmly in the informal camp here. Now we have to identify the key points to make, and these are pretty easy in an email because David's directly asked them to us. So we can make paragraphs about what David's friends can visit and what transport they should use. There are always 2 or 3 questions like this. In this example, there are only 2, so we can spend more of our time on both of them. But first, we need to write our introduction. And no, there's no title. You don't need to do the from so-and-so to so-and-so, subject, whatever. You can just get straight into writing it. But our introduction is going to be quite a lot different to the previous ones we've done. First, we need the greeting. This is usually going to be, hey David, or hi David, or something like that. And then we need a nice little sentence to express our interest in David's life and set up the kind of the context of the email. How's it going? It's so cool that your friends are coming to visit my area because it's such an interesting and diverse place. So we're responding to David and recognizing the purpose of this writing. It's really important not to miss this out. Some students look at what David wrote to us and want to write in a similar format, but that's not really the case. We're going to write a lot more than him and kind of decorate it better. And then we can go straight into the key points. First of all, they simply must head to the castle. It's from the 14th century, but it's still in great condition. What's more, they can get a guided tour right to the top, where there are some cracking views. After that, the cathedral is a must. The architecture in there is incredible, although they need to go in the afternoon to avoid the morning service. It would be tempting for students just to list a load of really cool places, but it's better to focus on 2 or maybe 3 and just give lots of details about them. And notice how friendly and colloquial the language is, even more so than the review and the article. Next, we're going to talk about the second key point, the transport. As for transport, they're going to need to hire a car. A coach is never going to fit around the narrow streets, which are really steep too, so cycling is going to be a nightmare for a whole week unless they're really sporty. If you want, I'll send over a map of the best parking areas in town. There were 3 types of transport mentioned in the question, so I think it's best to cover all of them. And as usual, the main thing here is to keep things concise and not waffle on too much. Then we're at the end, the conclusion, although it's not really a conclusion as we know it. We're going to write a nice little sentence to finish it off, and then we've got our sign off at the end. I can't wait for your friends to visit. Can you give me their contact details so I can get in touch with them? I'd love to meet up and show them around. A question is always great to throw in there because it gives David something to reply to, and for the exam it's bonus points for communicative achievement. And finally, the sign off, which for an informal writing is usually going to be like, speak to you soon, all the best, Sam. So let's take a look at the assessment criteria very quickly. Content, have we answered all of the questions and in enough detail? Yes, absolutely. Communicative achievement is about the greeting, the sign-off, those kind of decorations and the conventions of the writing, and I think we've covered that pretty well. And the style and tone is appropriate for an informal message to a friend. Contractions, exclamation marks, generally friendly tone. Organisation is much the same as any other writing, good paragraphs, logical order, and some nice connectors and signposts. To get good points in language here, we want to really include those phrasal verbs and colloquialisms, and we can find a few of them in there. It's so cool, cracking views, if you want, a nightmare, send over, get in touch. These are all really good examples. Now, if it's a formal email or letter, then the structure is going to stay the same, but we need to radically change all of that dressing that we talked about. I'm not going to go into masses of detail with this because a lot of it is the same as the informal, but we'll take a look at an example question. You see this advertisement in an English language magazine. Temporary staff required. Holiday jobs with countryside camps. We are looking for people to work at one of our exciting camps in the heart of the countryside this summer. Do you enjoy working with young people? Do you like sports? Do you speak English and at least one other language? If so, apply in writing to Paul Taylor Countryside Camps. Write your letter of application. So we're given someone to write to, Paul Taylor, and it's a letter of application. So it's going to be formal. And we can already see the 3 key points. They're pretty obvious. So we need to massively change our greeting and introduction from the informal email. We're going to write, Dear Mr. Taylor, I am writing to apply for the vacant position at country camps in the summer, as I believe I have the required skills and attitude to make a positive impact in the camp. Dear is a must, and then a sentence explaining why you're writing. Then you have the 3 paragraphs going over the key points in a formal way. Formal and polite and maybe convincing because it's an application. Then to conclude and sign off, we need 3 things. First, a summary line relevant to the topic. So this could be, thank you for considering my application. Or in a letter of complaint, it could be, thank you for considering my point of view. And next we need the classic, I look forward to hearing from you soon. Students can write this in all of their formal letters. And finally the sign-off, yours faithfully or yours sincerely. Now I think I've finally got it into my head which way round they are, but usually I have to look it up. Yours faithfully is when you don't know the name of the person you're writing to, yours sincerely is when you do know their name. So in our case it's going to be yours sincerely because we know it's Paul Taylor. Yours sincerely, Sam Johnson. Let's move on now and cover the last writing, the report. And no, I won't be covering the story from the B2 First for Schools because I don't have that much experience in it. I usually advise my students to avoid it, and I'd advise the same thing to you. Okay, on to the report. This is usually formal/neutral, and it involves giving information and sometimes recommending. A group of British teachers is going to visit your college for 2 days. The aim of their trip is to learn about how technology is used in education in your country. You have been asked to write a report for the group leader. Your report should include information about how technology is used to teach different subjects. Recommend which lessons the teachers should watch to see technology being used. Write your report. So in this case, the target reader is the group leader of the people coming to visit the college. This is not a letter to the group leader, but a document explaining and giving advice. So we should avoid addressing them directly and instead talk more generally. The key points in this one are very easy to find. They've even given them bullet points for us. But students should pay attention because each word might change the details of what you have to write. For example, when I first looked at the first bullet point, include information about how technology is used to teach different subjects, I kind of glossed over the different subjects bit and started writing about how technology is used in general. Then I went back and checked myself and thought I haven't included how different subjects are used, so I should do that instead. And reports are a bit unusual in that they need a title for the whole report, but also each paragraph, each section needs a title. So we're going to have 4 paragraphs: introduction, use of technology, lesson recommendations, and the conclusion. Very simple, they don't need to be clever titles, just focused and clear. And the title for the whole thing, again, super simple: the use of technology in education. In the introduction, we need to state the purpose of the report and what the reader will learn about. Note that this does not have to be engaging and intriguing like in the article and the review. The purpose of this report is to inform visitors of the uses of technology in our educational institution and in the country as a whole, and advise them on how they can best learn from the techniques used. It's quite dry and uninteresting. And it's supposed to be like that. Then we'll get into the key points, starting with the information on technology. This can be quite extensive, and students are allowed to use numbered lists and bullet points and things like that to organise the information better. The most common device used in maths and English is the interactive whiteboard. This has many positive benefits for both the teacher and students, including large screen for videos, easy display of presentations, interactive games and activities. Students also have access to handheld tablets for science. These have a variety of uses, such as taking photographs and researching information online. As always, being concise is really important here. That's why this bulleted list helps get across a lot more information without using tons of words. Again, here the tone is formal and bland. There are no exclamation marks or colloquialisms or anything to spice it up. Instead, we have longer, more sophisticated Latin root words. In the next paragraph, we have to recommend which lessons would be best to watch. Mathematics classes benefit greatly from the use of technology as students use the whiteboard on a daily basis. As a result, this should be the main focus of the visit. Nevertheless, it would also be worth visiting the classrooms of younger students where teachers often experiment with new devices. Check out that nevertheless. It's a really nice connector to throw in there instead of however. And these connectors within the paragraphs are quite important because there are titles separating each section. It's a lot more difficult to transition between them. So those connectors that you get between the sentences have much more importance. And finally, we'll round off with a short conclusion. The use of technology in our school is constantly evolving. Every teacher has their own method, so visitors are advised to ask individual teachers about their preferred methods. Lovely. Now, I'm not really the biggest fan of reports because they're usually quite specific and they require particular vocabulary around the topic. Plus the formal language and the format with the titles for each paragraph, students generally don't like that, so it's the first one to get the chop. But for your students, it might be their best option. And as with all of the question types, you can get my model answer in the description below and use it as a guide with your students. And it's helpful for you when it comes to assessment too, because the best way your students are going to improve at their writing is from your feedback. In the next video in this series, I'll be going over my assessment technique, from my colour-coded marking system to analysing the teacher's handbook and how that shows us we should score our students' work. And when that's ready, it will be right here. But if it's not quite ready yet, then it will be an equally helpful video. But for now, I've been Will from Enchanted ESL, wishing you all the joy and success in your teaching. See ya!